Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. The Taliban say the reduction of violence week is over, and they also say that they will resume attacks against government forces. Now, this comes just days after signing a deal with the US aimed at bringing peace to Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the political landscape of Afghanistan continues to destabilize as President Ghany refuses to the US-Taliban agreement of a prisoner swap. The Taliban say they won't go ahead with future intra-Afghan talks as per the withdrawal agreement if a prisoner swap doesn't take place. Now, the US has obviously reacted to this. General Scott Miller, the US Forces commander in Afghanistan, has said the reduction in violence was a confidence builder and that the US is very serious about their obligations, as should the rest of the parties be. To discuss more of this, we have with us former ambassador joining us from Istanbul, Mr. Mathew Bryza. We're seeing this development come at a time where a milestone event has taken place. An agreement has finally been reached between the US and the Taliban. And now the Taliban coming out, it seems, right after President Ghany saying, what prisoner swap? We're not agreeing to this. They're saying, well, the violence reduction in violence week is over, that they won't attack international forces, but they will go ahead with their agenda. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, this is the fatal flaw of this agreement, which we should call it what it is. I mean, it's simply a way for President Trump to be able to pull all U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, as he promised to do during his election campaign, with a very thin fig leaf, as we just heard one of the generals saying, as you quoted, of maintaining the U.S. obligations. The U.S. isn't maintaining any obligations. What the agreement is about is the U.S. gets to leave and will stay out as long as the Taliban doesn't facilitate or allow attacks against U.S. assets. And the credibility that if those attacks were to occur, that the U.S. would go back into Afghanistan under President Trump is zero. So like in the case of Vietnam, the U.S. has negotiated over the heads of the partner government. Then it was South Vietnam. Now it's the government in Kabul. The government in Kabul has not only not participated in these negotiations, but as you just said, is now going to be subjected to resumed attacks. So the U.S. is simply running out, not as fast as it can, but running out, locking the door behind it and moving on.
Now, the agreement did say that the U.S. troops and the coalition troops would not withdraw until 135 days. And of course, there are a lot of caveats that if these conditions are met by the Taliban, et cetera, et cetera. But let's not forget here also that the U.S. has officially not come out to endorse President Ghany's win, which has been delayed in itself by 5 months because of many contested votes, which have partially been audited, not completely. And he's got political opponents out there who question whether he's got a short win either way. Is this the U.S. showing not the kind of, is not showing support to President Ghany right now?
Well, for sure, the U.S. is not showing support to President Ghany because of what you said, but also because in the midst of this political chaos, without a clear leader after the Afghani elections, the U.S. is saying we're leaving militarily. I mean, how can the situation possibly be better for the government of Afghanistan if there are no U.S. troops on the ground that are providing any sort of stabilization? The situation cannot get better. So this is a gigantic vote of no confidence in the overall government of Afghanistan. It really has the feel of something that was forced on President Ghany, because it always struck me as far-fetched that he would simply agree to allowing 5,000 Taliban prisoners to leave prison. Clearly, he hasn't agreed to that. Right. Clearly, this is something that my former colleagues have tried to force down his throat, and he doesn't like it.
But it's hard to believe then that how the U.S.'s point man, Mr. Zalmay Khalilzad, now these talks have been going on for 18 months. He's been leading it from the Washington side. But it's hard to believe that he wouldn't have President Ghany, tapped into what has been developing as now the culmination, now the agreement, the withdrawal agreement with the Taliban. It almost seems as if it's President Ghany's sort of last resort to make a stand, to sort of show his significance.
That could be. That could be domestically. And I know Ambassador Khalilzad well. I worked closely with him for years at the White House. He is an extremely gifted negotiator. He's creative. He builds rapport with whomever his counterpart is. And in this case, he's a fellow Afghani. But there also is a tradition, an ugly U.S. diplomatic tradition of forcing unpalatable factors in agreements on friendly negotiating partners. So this could also be a case of the U.S. saying, sorry, President Ghany, you're weak. It's not clear you have legitimacy. We've got to get this done now. We're not going to wait anymore. And sorry, you're going to have to agree to these 5,000 prisoners being released. And to me, it's completely plausible that Ghany said, no, I'm not going to agree. And then Ambassador Khalilzad said, well, it's too bad. You're going to have to agree. And the Secretary of State is coming here. You're going to be embarrassed if you don't agree. This wouldn't be the first time that the U.S. has behaved that way. And Ambassador Khalilzad, as much as I respect him, did do some kind of similar things in northern Iraq way back when in 2003.
No, but you see this in itself, as that we heard the General Scott Miller comment on this also, that this is a confidence-building measure. There are essentially about 10,000 Taliban fighters who are right now in custody, who are detained. So having these 5,000 released would have got the ball rolling. This concession not being handed, the kind of digging his heels that President Ghany is showing, it seems like he's pretty much on his way out.
It does seem that way. What I'm trying to say is, as a 23-year diplomatic veteran who has led all sorts of peace negotiations in wartime in the Caucasus, I would not imagine possibly exposing a head of state to something that he's going to find unpalatable and is going to announce. I would know for sure what that head of state's reaction is going to be before I would ask my Secretary of State to show up and bless the agreement. So something went terribly wrong here. And if President Ghany had agreed to this release, which again would seem to be sort of unlikely, but if he had agreed and now is walking it backward, well, yeah, that is an unforgivable double crossing of the U.S. negotiators. And then I think he has put his presidency in grave jeopardy. But I haven't heard any statements by the U.S. saying something like that. It's sort of just kind of, this is out there, the Ghany refusal to release the prisoners. And then Washington is just sort of saying, well, let's move on.
Right. Let's welcome the voice here from Kabul. In fact, Mr. Hamdullah Hamdard is joining us. He's the Director of Public Relations Coordination for Afghanistan, Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Mr. Hamdard, the conversation essentially is on what is the incentive here for President Ghany, who will be inaugurated on March 9th. From March 10th is expected the intra-Afghan talks will take place, but the condition was the prisoner swap, that 5,000 prisoners will be released, which President Ghany has said absolutely not.
One of the articles in the MOU that is signed between the Taliban delegation and Zalmay Khalilzad says that Taliban will release 1,000 government either officers or military troops, etc. And the government will have to release 5,000 Taliban. This is something that totally belongs to the Afghan government to decide whether they want to release the Taliban prisoners or not. This is not something that the US or the Taliban will agree on that, or they will have to decide that. If President had previously agreed on this, then it's okay. It's something implementable. Otherwise, if President Ghany is not asked for his decision in this regard, then I guess President Ghany is not, he does not have to implement this. And once the intra-Afghan peace talk starts, then President Ghany can talk to the Afghan delegation can talk to the Afghan Taliban, and if they agree on this, then it's possible and it's implementable. Otherwise, something that is decided between the US and Taliban, the Afghan government is not obliged to implement that.
But Mr.
So
Hamdard,
that is something which is...
Why now, Mr. Hamdard? It's been 18 months of these going on between the US and the Taliban. They're on and off again talks, 20 years of war. Why now, when an agreement has finally been signed between what was being seen as a completely not budging Taliban, and now President Ghany walks in and says, absolutely not, will not respect one of these clauses?
President Ghany is defending the independence of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. If he implements this, then it will question the independence of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So if the US has decided to ask the Afghan government to release 5,000 prisoners and to swap it with 1,000 Afghan prisoners that are with Taliban, or they might not have them at all. So then this is a decision that is made only by the US. It's a one-side decision. If they have not discussed this
ideologically, I agree with you. I see your point here, but when I say 18 months of these negotiations have finally culminated in an agreement where the US is ready to withdraw, the Taliban is ready to de-escalate violence. The thing is that the President Ghany, the Kabul government have not been part of these negotiations for 18 months. Why now come in the forefront as a spoiler instead of a confidence builder?
Well, I guess that so far, the articles that are put in the MOU, they were hidden and they were not shared with anybody. I mean, the details were not shared with anybody. I don't know if the correct information was shared with the President Ghany by Zalmay Khalilzad and by his team when he was visiting Kabul from time to time. If the information was not shared, or the complete information was not shared, and if Ghany had not agreed, then I guess it was a big mistake that they had put this condition or this article in the MOU. Otherwise, if President Ghany has agreed or had agreed, then I guess then he might be trying to bring a little bit more pressure on Taliban to get ready for the Afghan peace talks and to initiate that as soon as possible.
Mr. Mathew Bryza, do you agree with this assessment that Mr. Hamdard is giving, that it could be a possibility that the clause, the agreement, incomplete information or incorrect information was brought forward to Mr. Ghany, and which is why now that he has full disclosure, he is taking this stand?
I very much agree. I was actually trying to make that point. As I was saying, this wouldn't be the first time that the United States has tried to force an unpalatable provision on a friendly government. And if you're the negotiator, if you're Ambassador Khalilzad, you know U.S. President Trump he's given you a very clear set of orders, which is get the agreement to get our troops out, do whatever you need to do. And so it could be that Ambassador Khalilzad got a little bit careless or was overly pushy and demanded that President Ghany agree to something that President Ghany never agreed to. That's one option. But I also agree with our friend who was just on one of his other speculative possibilities, which if Ghany did agree, well, he may be then saying, I'm not ready to release the 5,000 prisoners now because he wants some leverage in the talks that will finally, hopefully, take place that involve the Afghani government. And who knows? If I were President Ghany, I would not want U.S. troops expeditiously to leave Afghanistan because that's quite a security blanket for myself and my own survival to have those troops there.
Right. And Mr. Hamdard, this situation evolves. We're also seeing the opponents to President Ghany who have contested his win, Mr. Abdullah coming out and saying that this is President Ghany trying to monopolize the intra-Afghan process. This situation that is unfolding politically within Afghanistan, how is the Kabul government going to be prepared to handle this ahead of the intra-Afghan talks?
I believe the Afghan government has the capacity to ensure the internal, across the country, the consensus on the Afghan peace talks, and to bring together all the politicians, the political parties, and also to arrange, once again arrange the Loy Jirga, consultative Loy Jirga for peace. The Afghan government has the capacity and they have the determination, they are determined to do this. And once they have the national consensus in Afghanistan, then I guess there will be a coordinated voice in a coordinated delegation elected or selected by the Afghan government, and it will be led by the Afghan government. Then they will be ready to talk with the Taliban. There is no problem. Of course, till the moment, the teams, the electoral teams who lost the elections to President Ghany, they are showing some resistance, and still they are making some noise, not accepting the results of the presidential election, just to get some positions or to get some ministries and embassies or other government positions. And they want to enter the government either as kind of like a shared government or something like that. But President Ghany is not ready this time to share the power. However, he might give one or two or three ministries to Dr. Abdullah in his political fix that he has with him. But he will not share the power this time. The president will lead government, and as the only president, there will be no CEO this time who will be sharing the power with him. And I guess there is no problem in this regard.
especially in a time where the US, as you mentioned, is orchestrating what can only be understood as a very hurried withdrawal, trying to do its best to mend fences here while it looks to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. The situation, as we talked briefly about the political instability, there's also a big concern, and this is US military estimates talking about the number of ISIS fighters on Afghanistan soil increasing. They've given estimates of 2,000 fighters. Now, if this withdrawal continues in this landscape, there should be a big concern, should it not, that ISIS will see this power vacuum to gain strength.
Yeah, there should be a huge concern. And I recall back during the Obama administration, when then President Obama first announced in whatever it was in 2010, there'd be a surge of troops. And then the United States would pull its troops out of Afghanistan. Again, I remember asking my colleagues, how can this possibly be successful? If you're going to pull out and you already have such instability in Afghanistan, how can it be better if that stabilizing force is gone? So yes, I think this, the lack of a U.S. troop presence on the ground, particularly when Secretary of Defense Esper has made clear that for now, until all the 14,000 troops are pulled out, they will still be conducting counter-terrorist operations against Islamic State and others. That just shows by logical extension that the U.S. military presence is needed on the ground. So I think this is an example of President Trump saying, we've done what we can do. We've paid already our dues in terms of so many lost lives, so much treasure, $1 trillion. We all know from that amazing Washington Post investigative reporting from about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, that U.S. military leaders were not telling the truth at how our strategy was failing. Right. So President Trump is saying, I've got two terrible choices. Continue this fiasco, blood and treasure, or get out and then deal with terrorism in another way. And I think he's taken this very tough decision. Right. I, as a foreign policy former professional, may disagree, but you know, he's the president, and he's taken a very tough decision, much to the chagrin of the Afghan people, especially the women and girls who have finally received so many of the rights they should have always had in the first place.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Mathew Bryza, joining us there from Istanbul. Coming back to you, Mr. Hamdard, about this very question about the concern, not only within Afghanistan with the U.S. military, but also regional states who have talked about this power vacuum could give headway to ISIS.
I believe there will be no room for ISIS to get activated or reactivate in Afghanistan. ISIS is totally abolished. And they will not find any room for starting their activities once again in Afghanistan. However, if Taliban re-escalate their activities or their attacks, then of course the government will have to react. And then I believe, unfortunately, that there will be no peace deal at all. However, if Taliban and the Afghan government both stick to the Afghan peace negotiation, the intra-Afghan peace negotiations, then they can proceed with the they can make some developments and the progress will be made in the intra-Afghan peace talks. If both sides resist and show resistance and not talking to each other or not agreeing to each other, then I guess there will be no good news of peace at all. And people are expecting both sides to show some flexibility towards each other. The decision that is made in the MOU signed between Zalmay Khalilzad and Taliban regarding release of the prisoners is something that is not implementable at all. However, if President Ghany had agreed, then it might be implemented later on.
Right. And the real risk of ISIS gaining ground is, as Mr. Hamdard said, if Taliban don't get on the same page in the intra-Afghan talks with the government. Well, we've run out of time now. We'll take a quick short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. The Turkish Interior Minister has said today that over 100,000 migrants have left Turkey through Aegean, the northwestern province that borders Greece and Bulgaria. Now, we heard last week from Turkey that it would go ahead and allow migrants to its crossing points into Europe, taking a step back essentially from a 2016 agreement, which agreed upon by President Erdogan would halt the flow of migrants into Europe. Now, this has happened because the conflict in Idlib in Syria has taken a turn for the worse. Last week, we saw over 30 Turkish soldiers killed in a strike in Idlib. which was then retaliated by the Turkish forces by what they are calling Operation Spring Shield. And in this, till now, the count on Syrian regime forces being killed is 93 at this point. To further discuss how the situation is escalating and the cost being paid most by the civilians on the ground, hundreds and thousands of which are rushing to Turkey to escape this bomb-ridden region of Syria, we will be talking to our guests about the future of the situation here. Let me first introduce a journalist from TRT World. Right now at the border between Greece and Turkey, Mr. Semir Sejfovic, who is joining us. Also, we will be talking to a journalist, Mr. Kamran Gasanov, joining us from Moscow to get insight and better understanding of the situation as it develops. But first with you, Mr. Semir Sejfovic, where you are located right now, I want to start off with asking you, what is the situation when it comes to the refugees, the hundreds of thousands running to enter Turkey? Tell us a little about that.
Well, the situation has been escalating here since I got here, for about 3 days. There has been immense violence being used by the Greek border police. We have had plenty of opportunities to see the violence going on here at the border. I spoke to a family that came from Afghanistan whose 2 children almost suffocated to death here on the border as Greek border police are shooting tear gas, shock bombs, as well as rubber bullets and live fire into the air in hopes of trying to disperse these people. One thing that I want to make clear and for our viewers to understand this is that Turkey has been abiding by the deal it signed with the European Union in 2015, that it is quite what, as President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said, it is the other party that is not fulfilling its obligations in terms of this agreement. So thousands have been approaching this border, and they are continue to flow in, even though the Greek authorities and Bulgarian authorities have beefed up their borders, deploying their armies all across this border. The Greek border is about 220 kilometers long with Turkey, and it is all covered with police and security forces. Then yesterday we had a death which was caused by a shock grenade being shot at a Syrian refugee, a male. He was shot directly in the face by Greek border police, and this was the cause of death.
It seems we've lost Mr. Semir Sejfovic right now. There has been some technical problem. Internet blockage has just taken place. He was there standing between the border of Turkey and Greece. Let me come to you, Mr. Gasanov. What he lightly touched upon here, and I want to expand a little more about the refugee crisis as it is evolving in Syria. Hundreds of thousands are now trying to rush into Europe here, something that President Erdogan wanted. He's going to step back from that deal in 2016 that essentially ensured that Turkey would halt the flow of migrants. The challenges for Turkey have been quite a few, not the least are the 3.7 million Syrians they already have given space to refuge to in Turkey. What is Europe's stand right now when it comes to the refugee crisis? Are they reacting too slow, or are they reacting at all?
I think that the current refugee crisis is caused by clashes in Idlib between Syrian regime and Turkish forces, and this clash is escalating. Recently, I read that Turkey downed another third Syrian jet, and this is actually bad news before Putin and Erdogan meeting. Mm-hmm. As for refugee crisis, I think that the situation is very dangerous because about 80,000 of migrants already crossed the border, and I think that the numbers will be increased. And from the point of view of Europe, I think this is the violation of the agreement of from March 2016, right. And Turkey was obliged to stop migrants. From the other side, I also understand that until this clash will not stop, a lot of migrants are still coming to Turkish territory, and Turkey cannot share the burden of these migrants because already 4 or 5 million of refugees is present on the Turkish territory, and Turkey already gave, yesterday I heard that Erdogan said about, I think, $80 billion or something like that, and it is much more than Europe pledged to give to Europe. Europe pledged about 6 billion.
6.6 billion. Absolutely. So that's the argument here, that Europe had pledged 6.6 billion, only given roughly half of that yet, and yet the situation is escalating day by day. Turkey's biggest beef was in Idlib, as it supports the opposition forces there who are trying to keep control of the last rebel-held province, is that they're trying to create a buffer zone. They don't want the refugees to be coming into Turkey itself. But Europe's response has been very weak in that turn. It's not really helping the situation.
Europe actually is helpless because what happens in Idlib, between Russia and Turkey, Europe cannot influence. It could provide Patriot missiles, but this can bring to the war between NATO and Russia, and Europe doesn't want to bog down in another conflict. And now for Europe, the first aim, I think, is to help Erdogan and Putin to conclude a new agreement, to make a ceasefire deal, because this is the only option which can stop the second refugee crisis in Europe, I think.
And this summit is expected to take place on March 5th. Let's add another guest to this conversation. We have with us Mr. Fadel Abdul Ghany, an analyst joining us from Doha right now. Mr. Ghany, the situation as it evolves is getting more tense by the minute. Another Syrian jet has been shot down by Turkish troops. The count on what we have at this point is 93 Syrian regime forces have been killed by this new offensive by Turkey. As the situation evolves, the March 5th summit, what are your expectations? Is there a possibility, seeing the way things are turning out, that Turkey and Russia are headed towards an all-out war with each other?
I want to highlight a very important issue related to your question is what we are noticing in Syria, that a few F-16 aircraft plus anti-air missiles is implemented almost safe zone in northwest Syria, which protected hundreds of civilians from being killed. And that's very important message, and that's showing how is the international community dealt with the Syrian for almost 9 years. We keep requesting for a safe zone. People in Syria being killed like less than animals by the aerial shellings, and always been there is like justification and like putting huge difficulties in front of us when we highlight and requested the safe zone from the barrel bombs and from the aerial shellings, which is lead to above than 90% from the total casualties and destruction in Syria. That not required lots of effort, but saving like hundreds of thousands and will save hundreds of thousands of civilians in Syria. So I think that what is prevent any type of solution or protect the civilians is the international community responsibility. Turkish government alone almost like threaten the regime like forces and save like tremendous amount of Syrian lives. And those should be the utmost care in front of and responsibility for several states to protect civilians from crimes against humanity, which is extrajudicial killing.
But Mr. Ghany, okay, let me actually put this question to Mr. Gasanov to get him part of this conversation. But wouldn't it then be also argued that wouldn't you expect President Erdogan to agree in a heartbeat with Putin if the conditions were met here, which were the biggest concerns are the refugee crisis, to stem the flow of the thousands who are flowing into from Syria into Turkey? Mr. Gasanov, this is for you. And also the question about those sort of extremist elements that threaten the peace and calm of Turkey.
Now the chances for an agreement between Turkey and Russia are increasing because yesterday, I think, Russian military was deployed to the city of Sarakip. This is on the crossroads between M4 and M5 highways. And Turkish military now will stop its operation. It maybe will bomb Turkish Syrian jets and Syrian army, but will not move forward. And I think Russia should deploy its troops along the whole front line, and it will help to stop Turkish advance and will force Turkey to sign an agreement, a ceasefire agreement. And I think that this is the best option in such a very serious situation, which endanger us with maybe the Third World War.
Mr. Ghany, coming to you on this, the political common vested interest here in resolving this conflict politically for both President Erdogan and Putin, what, in your view, are those that could be addressed or should be addressed on March 5th?
I think that based on our experience with the Russian cannot be a trusted party in Syria at all. It's still support Assad regime totally, not only military, but also prevented any type of accountability. We will never forget that they, via veto, rejected any type of referring to the ICC. We will never forget their also media propaganda. 2 days ago, Russia Today is criticizing Syrian Network for Human Rights and criticizing any channel who is reporting about the violation of the Russian forces' war crimes committed in Syria. So the Russian is a very decisive supportive to the Assad regime. I think that the Russian also it should be highlighted at this meeting that the Russian cannot be trusted, even if they endorse or sign any agreement. We noticed that how is violated also Sochi agreement, for example. How is violated a Ghouta agreement, which was a direct party signed in Cairo by also the armed opposition group, but then they stood beside the regime and kicked those group out, and then they support the regime in the chemical attacks in Douma as well, and also prevented the OPCW. So they are engaged in different layers to support this regime. We don't believe that the Russian will halt or supporting Assad regime. We cannot believe in the Russians. So I think that the only solution is to bring other allies, such as the American and the European, and engage them with the negotiation against the Russian and the Iranian. Otherwise,
well, the Americans don't want to be part of this. They've already pretty much jumped ship. In fact, when President Erdogan asked for President Trump's help in providing the Patriot missiles, anti-missiles system, the Patriot missile system, he's refused essentially. All he's offered is that he could try and get NATO to lobby NATO members to provide Turkey with the Patriot missile system. But let's take this conversation further. Mr. Gasanov, the question here, do you agree that Russia cannot be trusted and essentially the summit is in peril itself? Because as some analysts say, that those 30-plus Turkish soldiers that were killed last week, that was the doing of the Russian Air Force.
I should mention two things in my last statement. First of all, that Russia is fighting against Al-Nusra, and this organization, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is considered as terrorist everywhere, in Arab countries, in Turkey, in Russia, in Europe. And I also understand that a lot of causalities we see because of bombing of Assad regime, but he has no choice. It's maybe stupid, but it's so. He attacks Al-Nusra, and Al-Nusra is hiding itself among citizens, and we see causalities. About the statement of our previous expert that Russia cannot be trusted, I think you can blame until end of the time Russia, but without Russia you cannot solve the problem, because Russia supports the regime which is supported by the most population of Syria and controls the most territory of Syria. And until now, only Russia and Turkey could bring to some agreement. And I think the more players we have in these talks, the more difficult would be the solution. And I think that Erdogan and Putin are wise leaders. They can achieve a ceasefire agreement which will reflect the interests as opposition, as the regime, and will stop the killing of citizens.
So this does put us in a situation, there's a conundrum here, because Russia has also said on Sunday that they cannot guarantee the protection of the Turkish aircrafts flying into Syria because of what Damascus has said, that it's closing the airspace over Idlib. Given the situation here, not being able to trust Russia, Mr. Ghany, as you feel, what are the options on the table? The international mediators themselves have done very little in the past.
It's unacceptable that Russian or the international committee making us choose between Assad or extremist group. Both are terrorists. Assad is more terrorist and more killed than terrorist group than Al-Nusra. And Al-Nusra or ISIS are also terrorists. We rejected both of them actually. So this propaganda from the Russia is like very clear. We are killing civilians because of Al-Nusra. So this is no one is believed. And there is like yesterday New York Times published a report and the Commission of Inquiry in Syria, based on the Commission of Inquiry report, which is mentioned that Russia is committed war crimes. That's very obvious actually. I think that the only way is the safe zone to protect the civilians, to establish also here a government. That government lead the negotiation on the Syrian soil. If Assad not pressurized further, Assad and the Russian will continue their attack until seized all the territory. Then they will lead that to total impunity. But that will never lead to the steady in Syria society. The revenge circle will be exist, and also that this recipe is very much generating for the extremist group, because they will notice very clear that there is no accountability. They will notice that Assad is and his militia plus the Iranian militia. We will never forget that the Iranian also is fighting like from sect background as Assad army, like 98% from Assad army officers are allied, which is also this regime is the discriminate regime based on the international law. If we want to describe this regime, this discriminate regime background from his sectarian actually. So based on that, there is no solution at all with Assad exist. With the Russian support, the Russians need to change their strategy in Syria and to rethink again that rehabilitate this rooted regime is impossible. Like 6 million Syrian out of Syria and also plus 6 million Syria, so half of the IDP, so half of the population, and also the population inside Assad regime is being affected from this regime. So now you pressurize all of this population to accept this government like that. That's crazy actually. So only solution is to convince Russia via the economic sanction and all types of sanction, and by resistance also, and by fighting in the media via also report, human rights report, that we will never accept this government at all to lead us again after all of this failure.
Right, Mr. Ghany, but coming to you, Mr. Gasanov, Russia needs to be pressurized to change sides, reduce the support it has shown to Bashar al-Assad, whether it's with sanctions that it's already facing, an economy that has already negatively been impacted by these sanctions, but the vested interest it has with Turkey on the diplomatic front, it could be only hope then, and I wonder if you agree with this, that Mr. Gasanov, would Russia and Turkey finally see a conflict resolution without the military force in this March 5th summit coming up?
Yes, the sanctions is very heated. They heated Russian economy, but not so much as the observers in West write about this topic. It may be very little numbers. And now I can also add to your comment that in German Bundestag, in German Parliament, the chairman of International Committee said that if Russia doesn't stop its actions against opposition, against people in Idlib, they want to impose new sanctions. But we shouldn't also forget that the sanctions also make a lot of danger to Europe as well. As for military crimes, I would also add here that we shouldn't forget about U.S. actions in Raqqa. About 40,000 people were died, and if we talk about that players who committed crimes couldn't be allowed to speak on the table, then we should also reject the United States.
Right, but it shouldn't be a competition on who's done worse where. I mean, it should really be about the kind of pressure these stakeholders need to get from international leaders in order to pull out from this horrible humanitarian crisis that is unfolding here. Well, we've run out of time, unfortunately. Mr. Gasanov and Mr. Ghany, thank you so much for speaking with us here on Newswire. We will be seeing you again tomorrow with more news and analysis. Till then, goodbye.